Hello, and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk about stress and stress in the workplace. There's stress at home, there's stress out there in the world. But, there's just so much right now. I find that even more than ever, there's so much anxiety and depression and stress going on. And so I thought it was really important to bring on a guest who could speak to that. John English is here with us. He is an award-winning author, coach, and successful entrepreneur who founded 4 different businesses: manufacturing, engineering, publishing and education, and coaching and development. So he's applied this to many different areas, and he talks about how to heal stress at work. So I'm really excited to have him here. John, welcome, Leaders of Transformation.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm really honored to be on your podcast and looking forward to speaking about how really almost everyone can stop the stress that they experience day to day.
Good, good. Well, that's an important topic. I don't think there's anybody that doesn't experience stress or hasn't experienced stress at some point in their life. So let's talk about where it comes from. I know people can, blame it on technology, the pace of technology, trying to keep up with the competition, the fact that there's just so many different devices to manage and all of that. But underlying that, what is the real cause why we get stressed?
I'm so glad that you asked that question, and it's a perfect way for us to begin. I have a saying that pressure doesn't have to become stress. And everybody has pressure in their work life and in their personal lives. And what has happened is that pressure has actually become medically what is referred to as the stress response. And everybody has a stress response. And basically what happens is your brain triggers a reaction in your physical body, which we don't need to go into how, that all happens, but it happens within your brain due to the way you are thinking and feeling about something, or if your life is actually physically in danger. And the reason that the body triggers that stress response is so that you can either fight or run to save your life. It's the fight or flight. And what has happened due to, I would say the pressure of our modern world. And for example, when I first started work, I can accomplish in one day now what I used to be able to probably accomplish in a week due to technology. And so what that has done is that it's sped everything up. And what happens is people are spending. Now, what's meant to happen is you launch the stress response, you move into fight or flight, and then you're meant to move out of it. But what happens is people don't move out of it. And it's the World Health Organization has called it the health crisis of this century, that we need to, that leadership really needs to step up and do something about stress training. And really I was a lifelong sufferer of different stress-related disorders, ailments, I should say, due to being an entrepreneur and raising a family and everything else. And I decided that I just had to figure out a way to do it. So we can stop the pressure from becoming stress, and we can just use that pressure to perform. And it's so much easier and simpler than most people would think. But we've just become accustomed to living in fight or flight so much of the time, especially at work.
So what I'm hearing is it's a conditioned response, and then
Yes.
we just continue to perpetuate it. And, and then I think about myself, like if a certain situation happens, I go into that fight or flight mode, and then I'm more hyper aware of other opportunities or dangers around me because I'm focusing on it now. And then I'm going to see more reasons to be stressed and hypersensitive. So it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, because I see more of what I'm looking for. Is that?
Yeah, it feeds on itself.
Yeah. So how do we resolve this? How do we, as leaders, some of the people that are listening are leading themselves and they're a solo entrepreneur. Some have large teams that they're responsible for. How does a leader start this process of managing stress more effectively?
Well, essentially, the answer to that is to use the practice of mindfulness, which is to just be present in the moment and aware of your emotions and your thoughts. So that's essentially the healing, or you could say the cure for our stress problem. There are some cases where people have mental issues or mental illness or something like that mindfulness is much more difficult for. But it's much more difficult for them. But I found that about 95% of the population of the people that I've taught mindfulness to can use it to drastically reduce their stress. So, what's so interesting about the stress response is that when you have launched the stress response, you're not able, physically, you're just not capable of your best thinking. It's like you said, you're hyper aware of what could be danger to you. And that becomes kind of a mental thing. And, a lot of times we end up projecting and we really don't have that issue. We're just hyper alert looking out for it. So and that's due to when you're in the stress response, you are using what's referred to as the primitive portion of your brain, as opposed to the most evolved portion of your brain, which is your prefrontal cortex. So what I recommend that people do is that they learn about mindfulness. They can always contact our organization and we can help them get started with that. They learn mindfulness and teach it to their teams. And that's essentially one of the things that I do. And I work the mindfulness. I begin with stopping the stress response because it leads to so much better critical thinking. Our decisions are so much more sound. We're able to actually use the amazing power of reason in making decisions when we're not in the stress response. In other words, we are responding instead of reacting. It's called the stress response because you're responding to a threat. You have to respond to a threat. And in our modern world, there are very little threats. And so, that's essentially what I would recommend people do, that they bring the training into their teams, that they first, bring it into their life. I had a gentleman that I taught it to at Trinity Hospital just over the phone. I taught it to him and he's teaching it to the whole organization, mindfulness, and how to use my instant mindfulness method to stop the stress response.
So I have a question about this mindfulness, because I know as a coach, I work with entrepreneurs, and some are able to handle the stress better than others, right? And so as I work with them and give them some techniques in terms of how to handle it, some are just better at applying it than others. And one of the things that I notice is like they go, okay, yeah, so I'm aware of it, right? So raise that level of awareness and presence. Yes, I'm aware of it, but it doesn't make them change it. It's like they have a belief about it, which is so ingrained. You know what I'm saying? So that they don't actually, they're like aware of it. It's like knowing your story, you know your story from when you're a childhood. Okay, this is how I grew up. This is the fear that I have, whatever. But knowing it and transforming it are two different things. So how do you get people into that space of mindfulness where they actually believe it's possible to be at rest and be calm in the midst of all the pressure around them? Because some I just realized that some actually believe that that's the way it's supposed to be.
They do, and there's a belief system. You mentioned beliefs. There is a belief system, especially in kind of the corporate world, that a little stress is good. The problem is stress really means pressure, is what it means. But the problem is that most people cannot stop a little stress because of how pervasive it is. They can't stop a little stress from becoming the stress response. That's essentially the problem. And so the key to being able to stop the stress response and be mindful is to know how to stop the internal dialogue. So my journey was I had chronic headaches as a child. I had stomach issues. Later on in my life, I developed a series of migraines. I mean, it just went on and on. And what I ended up doing is I was fortunate enough to be trained by a couple of different cultures in ancient wisdom. And that's essentially where I learned this process and then just kind of adopted it for our modern society or modern culture. So really what the key is, the person needs to have an experience of it. And so actually there's ancient wisdom keepers called the Toltecs, which just simply means man or woman of knowledge. Probably it made most popular by Don Miguel Ruiz. He wrote a book called The Four Agreements. And they refer to internal dialogue, that voice in our head, as the bane of human existence. And that's how horrible it is. And so we're talking to ourselves about what it is that we're concerned about or worried about or stressed about, and then we launch the stress response. And you can stop that internal voice by having a focus in your body. And so what I teach people to do is to focus below their navel and then in their solar plexus. And when they feel that area of their body, when they place their awareness in that area of the body, it stops the internal dialogue. And it has another, which is, what I figured out, I was just told to stop my internal dialogue. I wasn't told how to do it. I was told how to stop my internal dialogue, and then I was told I needed to ground, and that was the way I was mentored. And then I figured out how to ground myself, how to stay centered in the moment. And then that's when I noticed that it also stopped the internal dialogue. And then the really big benefit to it was that the focus in my body and stopping the internal dialogue, there's something that happens with your physical body, your connection of your body with your brain. And the body lets the brain know your life's not in danger. Right now,
so that's the
your life is
belief.
not.
So that's the belief. It's like getting to that point of believing that you're not in danger.
Yeah, but it's a physical reaction. So there is beliefs associated with it, and I work with people on letting go of those beliefs, but it's a physical reaction. So the mind is chattering away about the deadline and whether everybody on the team is going to be able to get their job done. And what will happen, you begin to imagine what will happen if you miss the deadline, and all of that chatter initiates a stress response, because the brain can't distinguish whether it's real or imagined. And so it launches a stress response. But without that chatter and with being focused in your physical body, which I think is one of the big reasons for the yoga movement, because people get focused in their body. They have an hour without stress. And so by focusing in the body like that, the mind shuts down and it becomes crystal clear, and you're able to act with precision without the stress response. So having an experience of it is one way to discard all the beliefs. And then the other process is breathing. So I teach a simple box breathing technique. It's in for 4 through the nose, hold for 4, out through 4 through the nose. And so I'll do that breathe. I start the day with that breathing, and then you hold with your lungs empty for 4. And people can find box breathing on the internet. I can do it while I'm making a decision. I can do it while I'm thinking. And so over the years, by just training myself, have learned to really focus in my body. So an example of that is right now I'm not thinking and talking to myself about what I'm going to say. My focus is fully in my body and what I'm presently involved in right now.
Got it. So as a leader, this is something that we need to practice these things and ourselves, and that will give us what I heard, even what you talked about earlier. And I know from my own experience is that when I am present and when I am in that state of groundedness and being calm, mindfulness, is that I'm far more creative. I'm far more able to solve challenges, handle the challenges that come my way when I'm in that space, rather than when I'm all up here floating around and stressed out and or tense. So it's for the leader to practice it. Now, how do you recommend, you work with a lot of organizations to help them to bring this to the workplace? How do you, practically speaking, do you do workshops? How do you help them to implement it on an ongoing basis so that organizations become stress-free organizations? It may not be pressure-free, but they're stress-freer.
What I do is I meet with leadership and discuss with them how it works. Sometimes I even do a demonstration and let them experience it for themselves. And then I go to the location on site and offer half-day or full-day workshops and teach people how to do it. And then in the best case scenarios, which is what I really prefer to do, I follow up and have ongoing coaching to support the stress-free workplace with leadership, with key employees. And then from there, they move it into the culture of their organization. And we also bring mindfulness into communication. I've systemized communication so that we make sure that we check all the boxes whenever we have a communication about work, and I bring mindfulness into that as well. And there's a lot of, actually Aetna has the most studies on using mindfulness and the benefit, the return on investment. It's enormous for an organization. It's just incredible.
Yeah, talk about that. I was going to ask you about that. So let's talk about it now.
Aetna basically found out that and this is just employees who took at least one mindfulness class, not necessarily ongoing, had a $2,000 a year savings in healthcare costs. They had a $3,000 a year increase in productivity. And so there's just a bunch of information out there about how beneficial it is. And one of the things so you're going to have less medical expenses. You're going to have a happy team, which, the game is all about the players, right? It's just all about the players. And this is a way for an organization to show their employees how much they care for them and how much they care for their health and their well-being. You have less emotional outbursts at work. You just have a lot less of what wastes so much time in our human experience, especially when it comes to work. And the productivity gains there are enormous, right? Because that's lost time. You can't get that back. And basically the way that happens is when people aren't stressed, they behave a lot better. We all do. I behave a lot better when it's not just about decision making, it's about my behavior and the way I interact and communicate with other people. It's so much better when I'm not stressed out, let alone being in the stress response.
So let's say, for example, there's a situation, somebody's listening, they're like, okay, so I'm in this board meeting or, stressful situation where we've got deadlines and we're behind or whatever the case is. What are some of the ways, like right in that moment, talk about groundedness. I'm thinking about even like pattern interrupts. So
yeah,
if you notice, like for those of you watching, my cat has arrived and, and it's like such a pattern interrupt. I can be stressed. I can be really focused on something and or stressed about something, be uptight. And then he just makes me laugh, and it's like that pattern interrupt. I remember I used to work with these lawyers and we would be in these serious meetings or they would be in these serious meetings. Sometimes I would step in, but sometimes I was involved in that. And we would talk about what was going to happen and so forth and strategy. And then one of the lawyers had this incredible ability. He could have been a comedian. He had this incredible ability to just throw in this little bit of humor and it diffuses the pressure instantly and everybody laughs and then moves forward and actually moves forward more effectively, than before, because we were trying to figure something out or we were just so tense and it just diffused that energy. Can you talk a little bit about some of those ways that if somebody finds themselves in that situation or their team is in that situation, how they can't always bring a cat into the into the boardroom.
Can't bring a cat into the boardroom.
Although people are bringing their pets to work a lot more,
they
I
are,
hear.
which is really, really excellent. So, and thank you for bringing up the pattern interrupt, which, as far as I know, is an NLP technique, or they're the ones that made it popular. So I use those different techniques of neuro-linguistic programming. NLP is short for it, and the pattern interrupt is a huge one. And people who are highly emotionally intelligent, like the gentleman that you mentioned, have a way of doing that naturally, which is really excellent. Now, the focus what I do in a meeting like that is my focus is within myself, actually within my physical body. And then I'm present. And I look around the room and find a way to interact with the people that are there in a way that they can receive it, just like the example that you mentioned. So the focus in your body, if everybody is stressed out and then this person there's some humor and everybody kind of laughs, that's a pattern interrupt. You've just interrupted the pattern in the brain of everybody being stressed. Well, you can learn to do that on your own. By the focus in your body is a pattern interrupt. It interrupts the pattern of internal dialogue. It interrupts the pattern of stress, of being in the stress response. And from there, then you can learn to apply the pattern interrupt in the boardroom and interrupt whatever the negative pattern is that's taking place and move forward from there. The human being is an emotional, mental, and intuitive being. And when you're fully present, you will be amazed at how you will intuitively know what to say when, what action to take at the exact right time, which is super difficult to do. And I'd even venture to say almost impossible if you're in the stress response. If you're worried, if you're dialoguing internally about how bad everything is, then you really have a hard time doing that. But when you're present, in those moments, just what to say at the right time, what action to take, what body language to use. It really all just kind of comes to you because we're so intuitive. We're social creatures. We've been interacting socially for a long time. And that's all a part of us, and we can really tap into that power when we're present.
So I just had this picture of leaders. We talk about different skills that leaders need to have in order to lead effective teams and to create harmony and in the workplace and so forth, lead their industry and all that. And one of the things that I was just thinking about is a leader. You think of great leaders, they know how to do that subtle pattern interrupt. It's like I was thinking about sports teams, right? Sports teams, when you get to the end of the game and it's a tight game, what do? They do a lot more timeouts. They look at how do we shift the energy? We've got to shift the energy. The energy is going away from us. How do we shift the energy to go in the direction that we want it to go? And you see, actually, you can literally visibly see the energy shifting on the field. And if I think about leaders, one of the skills that great leaders have is that ability to interrupt the pattern and to shift the energy to go into the direction that they want it to go. And so if you're a leader and you're observing this, but you have to, of course, be mindful yourself. But if you're observing this and you're mindful and you're present, then you can see this happening around you and you can shift and guide and lead the people on your team in the direction that is going to best serve everyone who's involved. So yeah, I think it's a great skill to be able to interrupt. And you don't have to splash water on people like Tony Robbins does.
No, you don't. Or comment on the red shoes.
Right. That was funny.
Some offhand comment is I really do appreciate that. I like to use humor as well. It's funny you use the word shift. I wrote a book called The Shift, and last week I did workshop on site called The Big Shift When Shift Happens, because there's so much change going on within this company. So that's what we named and they named their 2-day conference after shifting. So I think it's an essential leadership skill, and it's an ability that I really believe almost every leader can develop. When you come into the moment and you're present and you're focused in your body, that's the time when everybody else is stressed out, and that's when they need a leader. That's when they need a leader. And by being present, by not being stressed out, by being centered and grounded in your personal power, then you can lead with your commanding presence.
Yeah.
And that's a really great place to be.
Yeah. I love that. That is great. Well, and when you talk about some of the organizations that you've worked in, I don't know how much you can share, but if there is let's say an example, maybe a really difficult situation that you were able to turn around using these techniques, could you share that?
Sure. There was an organization that I still work for, very successful company, started by 2 entrepreneurs, actually a husband and wife. And they built the company up over 20 years, and it was really successful. I mean, in the upper 5%, 8% or something like that of people who just found a business with nothing. And they burned out. And they burned out because of all the stress and the anxiety, and they were basically just done. And I came in and began with coaching them and taught them these techniques. And then eventually they hired a chief operations officer, and within a year of his coaching, he had learned all of these different techniques. And long story short, everybody in the whole organization now has been trained on how to communicate more effectively, how to stop the stress response, and that company has doubled in revenues. And also, and it was a nice sized company before then. And what has happened is it's given the 2 owners the opportunity to just completely move away from the business and not have anything to do with it. And then after taking some time off, really recreate the dream jobs that they want for themselves.
Nice.
So that's an example of, it's really hard to fathom. I mean, you'd have to spend some time just sitting thinking about it. What changes, what amazing benefit there could be in your organization if everyone there was only in the stress response if their life was in physical danger.
Yeah.
If people knew how to turn pressure into great critical thinking and into the best decisions and into using their intuition and into communication, better communication, as opposed to going into the stress response.
Yeah. Now let's talk about, I know you said you work with, when we talked previously, you work with mirrors.
Yes.
And that mirror work. So talk about what the purpose of that is, how that works.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a funny, quirky thing of human nature in that we see ourselves in other people. And what we see in other people is our shadow, which is what we don't see in ourselves. So internally, we don't see something in ourselves, but we see that behavior or quality in someone else. And it's referred to as projecting. So we project ourselves onto other people. And it's referred to as mirrors, which comes from ancient wisdom, but it's been brought in via NLP, and it's a little bit more mainstream now than it used to be 30 years ago when I first learned about it. But essentially a mirror, there's different sayings that we have. If you have one finger pointed at someone else, you have 3 fingers pointed at yourself. If you spot it, you got it, is another little phrase that we have. So if you are, let's use just the example of stress. Let's say that you are an extremely stressful person and you are unaware of this. You're very anxious. You're just unaware of that. You will notice that in other people and you will comment on it. Whoa, that person is really stressed out. Boy, do they have a lot of anxiety. So you see it in other people. And this works both for what you could, just for the sake of clarity of talking about it, this works for your negative character traits and what you could also say is your greatness. So we project what we don't see about our own greatness onto other people as well. And those are kind of the people that we put on the pedestal. So people that we put on the pedestal that we just think they're the greatest, we're not seeing those qualities within ourselves. They're there. And so that's what and we've actually brought this into the workplace and taught people about mirrors. And if you have an emotional reaction, positive or negative, an overly emotional reaction to someone else, it's a mirror. So we've taught that, and we've also started to bring in the different traits of what are ego traits and what are traits of your commanding presence, and how to operate in your commanding presence as opposed to different ego traits.
So that sounds really interesting. And I love this work because it goes deep into really, like you talk about awareness and mindfulness and presence. And then now that people, let's say they start applying, that you work with, they start applying this and they become more present, and they become more present to some of these things going on. It like opens up a whole new world. I know it did for me, is recognizing that as well, how I was projecting on other people, both the negative qualities and also the positive qualities, and how certain things just didn't even show up for me. And why did they not show up for me? Because I wasn't aware of them. I had a mentor one time. I said, "Oh, I'm observing this." I had a client who was suspected that he was fooling around with some people in the office, some women in the office. And I asked my mentor about this, and he said, honestly, I don't know how to respond to that. It doesn't come into my sphere of, like, it just doesn't come into my space at all. It's not part of, and then of course that made me think, well, why is it showing up in my space? Right. And so that was interesting, and it gave me that opportunity to look deeper into that. And that was years prior to my husband actually being unfaithful to me. So it's interesting. So I'm like, okay. So I've seen the power of this in my own life to go, oh, that's what's going on. So talk a little bit more about this. And then you talked about the command self versus the ego self.
Yeah. So mirrors fit into, I don't usually get into this over a podcast, but mirrors essentially fit into 3 categories: present, past, and future. So if you look at yourself and you're not stressed and you're not anxious and everything, maybe it's something from your past, and that behavior is trying to come back into your life, and that's why you're noticing it. If you then the present mirror, you look in I'm stressed, I'm anxious. You now identify it with yourself and you take action to correct it. And then what you mentioned is a future mirror. So that's where the intuition comes in. And you're actually hypersensitive about something because it's going to happen to you, or you're going to have an opportunity to engage it. So
interesting.
And then, so that's referred to as a future mirror. So there was something that you were noticing back then, but you weren't aware of it. So when it was going on, there were things that you were noticing that were cluing you in on a possible future scenario, and you just were blowing by them. So you weren't noticing them. So so really powerful. There's a saying in the Toltec path that the warrior learns to read the mirrors with stunning accuracy. So so that's really a lot of fun. And then the commanding presence is really your essence. It's if you took every great character trait that you have, every great personality trait, And you put those all together, that is what I would refer to as your commanding presence. Your commanding presence is also all of your experience and knowledge that you use as power to get things done. So that would be a way to easily describe your commanding presence. Whereas the ego is fearful, it's narcissistic, it's all about, everything is about you. Whenever we make everything about us, we're talking about behavior here, we've talked about behavior at work, we make someone else's behavior at work about us. So, and again, one example I like to use of that is driving. So I'm driving down the expressway. Okay, I live in Southern California, so
No shortage of traffic.
No shortage of traffic, and I'm driving down the freeway, and someone cuts me off. Okay, and it really, launches a stress response. We could even, and I hit the brakes, and we don't have an accident. So I can make that whole thing about me. Boy, what a jerk. I wish that person would learn to drive. What is their problem? And get all worked up about it. But that's the ego just making it about me. Maybe the person's wife is having a baby right now. Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe they are just not a very good driver. Maybe they are a very discourteous person, right? All of those things, I can just let that behavior, let that incident speak about them and tell me about them as opposed to making it about me. So another way to describe that is the ego loves to take everything personally and also make a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, I love that. What a great example for that as well, because how often do we see that? How often do we do it? How often do we see that occur in the workplace, on the roads? People get mad at, and that's just why that's such a perfect example. People get mad on the road all the time. I can't believe they did that to me. And it's like, well, they weren't doing it to you. I remember one of my mentors who teaches personalities. He says, people don't do things to you. They do things for themselves. And so when we realize that, we get less offended. Coming back to stress, a lot of stress in the workplace occurs because of other people and what other people do to us, or the frustration that we have with other people. And at one point I was doing this workshop on personality, and I came up with this thing. I said, choose fascination over frustration, choose curiosity over criticism, to try to explain to people that shift that happens within you when you get curious about what this other person, why they're acting that way, versus trying to change them or being frustrated about them and the discarding them. You bring up another really great point, which I appreciated, about the command response. I noticed there's this balance. It's like sometimes, and I've had clients specifically, even recently, ask me about this, when do I know that I'm a narcissist and that it's all about me? And when is it that I'm really just playing too small of a game and I need to play a bigger game because I just have so much more capacity and or such an incredible ability to communicate and be in front of large audience and so forth, whereas others can see that as, wow, he's such a self-centered ego maniac, and it's like, well, is he, or is he just playing out a natural strength that he has? So I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, dream big and play your big game. That's a part of your commanding presence. And, follow your passion and your bliss, and let other people make that about them if they want to, or let them, decide how because they're going to anyway. Just let them figure out how they're going to view that, and focus on one way that I found the easiest way to deal with the ego is to, the game is all about the players. So when it comes to leadership, it's all about the team and how I can support the team. Everything from action taken for insubordination and corrective action, all the way out to, rewarding people for wins. Everything in there is all about them and the fulfillment of the vision and our mission. And I make that really clear whenever I'm anywhere on that spectrum, that's what I'm doing. So by taking the focus off of ourselves and making it all about how we're going to serve others, servant leadership, then we don't really have to worry about the narcissistic, being a narcissist as opposed to just reaching for the stars.
Beautiful. John, thank you so much. This is so good. So I'm going to recommend that our listeners go to your website, ancientwisdomformodernbusiness.com, and you've got some great resources there. You also mentioned about your book, and so there's more great resources there. We'll make sure all that's in the show notes. And is there anything else that, just to wrap up, that you want to cover that maybe we haven't touched on before we end?
I would just like to reiterate that mindfulness and stopping the stress response is so much simpler and easier than you would think. And I just highly recommend that if you're listening to this today, that find out how to do it. Got
it. John, thank you so very much. I appreciate you. And I appreciate your presence, because you're just so calm and cool. And I just appreciate also the fact that you're going and teaching this into organizations. It's so, so important now more than ever that we teach people how to handle the stress so that we can be more effective. So again, thank you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. We appreciate you, and we would love to hear your stories. So if you have your stories about how this is affecting you, maybe even you have questions or comments about this, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us through the website, of course, leadersoftransformation.com. We're on social media as well. And so you can find us through that. And even just how you're creating transformation in the world. We'd love to hear your story. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, we've got so many amazing guests. We can't have everyone interviewed on this show, but we can certainly share what you're doing on social. We have a great platform on Facebook where a page that we have there where we share what amazing things people are doing in the world. And so we'd love to showcase you there, if not on an interview. So reach out to us and let us know what you're up to. There's so much good that's happening in the world, and we want to showcase that. And so that people can realize that they're not alone and that there are possibilities. There's a bright future for them. So we appreciate you. We thank you. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.